The hogs were screaming again. That sound rolled down the slope just before sunrise, scraping across the frozen trees and skipping like a curse over the frost. A squeal like that never meant feeding time. It meant rot. It meant death. It meant another settler's mistake had come to collect its toll before breakfast. Margaret Hollis did not flinch. She was elbow deep in frozen earth, kneeling just outside her cabin on the north slope, where the sun barely touched even in October. Her wool skirt had soaked through with melting frost hours ago. Her breath curled from her lips in thin ribbons of steam as she dragged the last flat stone into place, sealing off the narrow entrance she had spent 6 weeks building into the hillside behind her home. No one but her knew how deep it went. No one had ever asked. They just laughed. They called it the widow's tomb, said it loud enough for her to hear when they passed on horseback and saw her hauling buckets of clay and broken stone with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her face set hard as the rock she carried. Two men from the Denby place had slowed their horses one afternoon just to watch the way you might watch a dog chase its own tail. One of them tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am, you planning to bury yourself in there or just your dignity?" The other one laughed so hard he nearly fell from his saddle. Margaret had not looked up. She had not answered. She had simply lifted the next stone and kept working. But their laughter had gotten quieter since October. Now it came in side glances and half smirks, the kind people wear when they are no longer sure the joke is funny. No one said much about the widow's hole in the ground anymore. Not since the first snow hit early and hard, and two neighbors lost their entire preserves to spoilage in the same week. Not since Mrs. Denby's root cellar caved in under a layer of wet frost. Not since the preacher's wife, Ada Prescott, opened a barrel of salted pork, only to find it green and crawling with flies sealed under mold, like a coffin left out in the sun. Now they mostly just watched, quietly. But Margaret had never built it for show. She had not built it for pride or to prove anyone wrong. She had built it the night her husband died, when her hands were still shaking too hard to hold a spoon, and her belly was still too hollow to cry. She built it because she knew what cold could take, and winter was only just beginning. She had come to the frontier with a mule baby who would not live through the journey, and a man named James Hollis who had dreams big enough for 100 acres, and a body that would not last long enough to fence in 10. He was a stonemason before he turned farmer, and he had taught her things most women on the trail never learned. How to read the grain of a rock before splitting it. How to build a load-bearing arch without mortar. How to find the seam in frozen ground where a shovel could bite. James had taken a bad fall 3 days after they staked their claim. Frozen mud, a misstep near the creek bank, and a sound that came from his back like a green branch snapping under too much weight. He did not scream. He simply lay there in the cold, looking up at the sky, breathing in shallow sips until the breathing stopped. He never said a word. Not goodbye. Not her name. Not even a sound of pain. He left her with a shovel, a patch of trees, and neighbors who smiled like they pitied her until their backs were turned. The baby had died on the trail west, somewhere between the river crossing and the long, flat stretch of nothing that seemed to go on forever. Margaret had held the child against her chest, whispering its name into the wind long after the small body had gone cold and stiff. No one in the wagon train stopped. No one offered to dig. She buried her child beneath a young oak tree with her own hands alone and carved nothing into the bark because she could not hold the knife steady. When she reached the valley and James died, she had to dig again. The ground was iron. She started at noon and did not stop until after dark, her palms bleeding through strips of torn petticoat she had wrapped around them for grip. Ada Prescott, the preacher's wife, stood at the fence line of her own property and watched Margaret dig for nearly an hour. Then she turned and went inside and closed her door. No one brought a shovel. No one said a word. And when Margaret lowered James into the hole with nothing but a rope and her own trembling arms, the only witness was the wind. That was the day Margaret Hollis stopped expecting anything from anyone. She did not go to church after that, did not gossip at the well, did not ask for help or offer small talk or bring pies to the Sunday gatherings the preacher organized in his front yard. That made them uneasy. A widow who wept and begged was something they understood. A widow who said nothing and built things with her hands was something else entirely. She raised the cabin herself, one log at a time. Then the fire pit. Then the chimney half stone and half patched with river clay that cracked in the first frost and had to be sealed again with a mixture of mud and animal fat. She worked from first light to last, and sometimes beyond, by the glow of a lantern that swung from a nail above her door. Then she started digging. She picked the north side slope just behind her cabin, where the ground stayed dark and packed even in late autumn, and the sun barely grazed it during the shortest days of winter. For weeks, she worked late into the cold evenings, shoveling until her boots cracked at the sole and her shoulders burned from lifting stone. When the wind howled and other families gathered around shared fires, she kept at it by lantern light, alone in the freezing dark, the only sound the bite of metal into earth and the slow scrape of stone on stone. She lined the walls herself, fitting each rock with the care James had taught her. She remembered his hands guiding hers on the first arch they ever built together back in Pennsylvania, before the West was anything more than a word on a map. "You don't force the stone," he had told her. "You find where it wants to sit, and you let it." She could still hear his voice when she worked. It was the only company she kept. She laid a double roof over the chamber. One layer of timber, one layer of clay, buried under 2 feet of packed soil so the cold from above would press down evenly instead of seeping through in patches. She built narrow stairs leading down just wide enough for one person carrying a crate and fitted a flat stone door at the top that could be sealed flush with the hillside. From more than 10 feet away, you could not tell it was there at all. Inside, she drove iron hooks into the ceiling beams for hanging meat. She built low wooden racks along both walls for root vegetables and grain sacks. Near the back wall, she placed a stone shelf set slightly higher than the rest, where the air stayed coldest and most still, and that was where she planned to keep the buttercrock if she could ever afford one. The design was simple but precise. Stone floors, not dirt, because mice could not dig through solid rock. 2 ventilation holes, each no wider than a fist, angled upward through the hillside at opposite corners so air could circulate without letting snow or rain pour in. The chamber sat just deep enough below the frost line to hold a steady cold, not so deep that moisture would pool and breed mold, not so shallow that a warm day would ruin everything. It was a balance that most settlers never got right, because most settlers dug their root cellars the way their fathers had back east, where the winters were shorter and the ground more forgiving. Out here, the old rules did not apply. By the time the first real snow arrived, the pantry was colder than a well and dry as old bone. She stocked it with what little she had: salt pork wrapped in cloth turnips packed in sand potatoes, layered between sheets of burlap, and a small clay jar of honey she had taken as trade from a passing merchant who needed his horse reshod and had no money to pay the blacksmith. It was nothing fancy, but it was hers and it would keep. One afternoon, while Margaret was fitting stones into the arched ceiling of the pantry entrance, Jesse Ward, a boy of 17 from the farm down the road, stopped his horse and watched. He sat in the saddle for a long time, studying the way she wedged each piece into the curve without any binding material, the stones locking against each other under their own weight. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. Margaret did not look up. "From a dead man. My husband was a mason before he was a farmer." The boy sat there another moment, something shifting behind his eyes, then rode off without laughing. He was the first one who did not. By mid-November, the trouble started in earnest. The Denby family's salt beef turned brown and sour in a cellar that had flooded twice since October. The Munn's apples froze into mush because their root cellar had not been vented properly, and the moisture had turned to ice on the walls and then melted into the food when the temperature rose for 2 days in a row. Another family lost their entire store of cornmeal to damp the sacks gone bitter and gray with mildew. The preacher Wesley Prescott had built his root cellar too shallow, barely 3 feet down, and the first hard freeze had driven frost straight through the ceiling boards and into the barrels beneath. His wife found their potatoes, black and soft, collapsed in on themselves like small deflated lungs. She did not tell anyone for 2 days, hoping the damage was only on the surface. It was not. The Ogden family fared worse. They had trusted their stores to a lean-to shed on the north side of their cabin, packed with straw for insulation and sealed with pitch. The pitch cracked in the cold, the straw drew moisture, and by the second week of November, the entire stock of dried beans had sprouted mold so thick it looked like gray fur. Mr. Ogden rode to town 3 times in 4 days, each time coming back with less than the trip before. Each time someone would ride into town before dawn, bundled and panicked, hoping to buy back what the winter had stolen. But the shelves at the general store were thinning fast. The supply stage had been stuck in the mountain pass for 2 weeks. No fresh freight was coming. All that remained were a few jars of pickled eggs, some hardtack, and the sour smell of desperation. Margaret did not ride to town. She did not need to. She walked down the stone steps behind her cabin, ducked beneath the low entrance, and pulled out what she needed. Everything was cold but whole, dry, untouched. She ate quiet meals beside her fire, boiled turnips, thin strips of salted meat, bread baked with the last of her flour in a cast iron pan her husband had carried all the way from the east. And when the wind screamed through the valley and the hogs down the hill squealed their death sounds into the frozen air, she leaned back in her chair and listened, knowing full well they would not last another week. The first time anyone asked her for help, it was not with words. Ada Prescott came knocking with her knuckles stiff and pale, the skin around her eyes pulled tight with the kind of worry that had gone past tears and settled into something harder. She did not beg, did not cry, just said they had misjudged the frost and the barrel had not kept. She held out a patchwork quilt, clearly her best, and a small crucifix carved by her son, and stood there on the porch waiting for Margaret to weigh her worth. Margaret looked at Ada Prescott and felt something clench in her chest. This was the woman. The one who had stood at the fence line the day James died and watched Margaret dig alone until her hands bled, then turned around and gone inside without a word. The one who had closed her door while a widow buried her husband in frozen ground with no help and no witnesses. Margaret could feel the words forming at the back of her throat. Where were you? Where were you when I was the one who needed something? But she looked down at Ada's hands, the knuckles white and trembling with cold, and she saw her own hands on the night the baby died. The same white, the same trembling, the same desperate grip on something that was already gone. She nodded once, disappeared into the slope behind her cabin, and came back out with a slab of salt pork still wrapped in its dry cloth, perfectly preserved. Ada stared at it the way a drowning woman stares at a rope. Come back in 2 days, Margaret said, and closed the door. That was the only time she let herself remember the baby's hands. She did not allow that memory to return again. After Ada, they stopped laughing entirely. A week passed then, too. Snow came heavy, then sleet, then nights so cold the air cracked when you breathed too hard. Cabin roofs groaned under the weight. Chimneys froze over. The general store boarded shut after someone stole the last crate of coffee and a sack of oats in the middle of the night. The knocks came more often now. Margaret stopped tracking who it was by face and started recognizing them by the sound of their knuckles on her door. Soft and hesitant meant someone new. Quick and rhythmic was Jessie Ward, who always knocked the same way. Heavy and deliberate was Dalton Garrett, who knocked as if he were doing her a favor by asking. One evening, Dalton came himself, tall hat in hand, shoulders squared, a man who had clearly swallowed something bitter on the walkover and was still trying to keep it down. My wife's coughing blood, he said from the porch, his breath fogging the cold air between them. A warm meal might. He did not finish the sentence. Could not, it seemed. The words simply ran out of steam before they reached the end. Margaret nodded. She always nodded, took no payment, asked no questions, just ducked into the hillside and came back with what she could spare. A strip of dried meat, a biscuit wrapped in cloth, sometimes a small crock of preserved carrots, sometimes a careful pinch of salt measured out on the edge of a knife blade. They left silent, ashamed but grateful, and she watched them go from behind her door. She had built a pantry for herself, but now it fed half the valley. And yet no one offered to chop her wood. No one patched her roof. No one brought her extra nails or asked how her own health held through the storms. Their respect came with limits. She was still the widow, still odd, still someone they could accept help from, but not someone they could thank without feeling a sting. Among the visitors was Chet Boone the blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with hands like shovels and eyes that never quite met yours. He came one afternoon not to ask for food for himself, he said, but for his horse. The animal was the only one in the valley strong enough to pull the timber sled, and without it, nobody would have firewood or iron fittings. If the horse died, the forge went cold, and the whole settlement lost its only source of repaired tools and nails. Margaret gave him a scoop of oats from her stores. It was barely enough to fill both hands. As he turned to leave, Boone paused on the porch. He did not look at her, just stared down the trail toward the Garrett property, and his voice dropped low enough that the wind nearly stole it. You should be careful with Garrett, he said. He's not the kind of man who stays grateful. Then he walked away, shoulders hunched forward, as if leaning into a storm that only he could feel. Margaret watched him go and filed the warning somewhere deep next to all the other things she kept in the dark, where no one could reach them. The following week, Miss Alma Devlin came for the second time. She arrived early before the light had fully risen, and this time she did not bring tears. She brought a list. Names of families, how many children each had, how much food they estimated they needed to last through January. She stood on Margaret's porch and read the list aloud in her schoolteacher voice steady and precise, as though she were reciting multiplication tables to a room full of fidgeting students. Margaret listened. When Alma finished, Margaret asked a question she had been holding for weeks. Miss Alma, does it occur to anyone in this valley that I might need something too? Alma blinked. Her mouth opened and then closed. She looked down at her list as if the answer might be written somewhere between the names. A bale of firewood, Margaret said. That's all. One bale. I've been splitting my own since October, and the axe handle cracked last week. I've been burning furniture legs to keep the cabin warm. I gave your schoolhouse children butter that was worth a month of heat, and not one of the 5 families I've fed has thought to bring me a single stick of wood. Alma's face changed. The color rose in her cheeks, and it was not from the cold. It was the particular flush of a person who has just realized something obvious that should have occurred to them long ago and did not. We didn't think you needed anything, Alma said quietly. Everyone needs something, Margaret said. The difference is, I don't beg for it. Alma left with food for the children, but she walked slower than she had arrived, and her shoulders carried something heavier than the bundle in her arms. It was the first time Margaret had spoken the unfairness out loud, and the words hung in the air between them like breath in the cold, visible for a moment, and then gone. Nobody brought firewood. That silence told Margaret everything she needed to know about the valley's gratitude. They would take what she offered. They would eat what she gave. But they would not cross the invisible line that separated receiving charity from acknowledging a debt, because acknowledging a debt meant admitting that the widow on the hill was not just useful but necessary, and that was a truth none of them were ready to carry. It was made plain again on a night when the wind tore a plank loose from her cabin roof. Margaret heard it flapping in the dark, banging against the frame with each gust. She needed someone to hold the board steady while she hammered it back. Just one pair of hands. She stepped outside and looked down the slope at the valley below. Smoke rose from 5 chimneys. 5 families she had fed that month. 5 cabins full of people who owed her something, even if they would never say it out loud. No one came. No one ever came. She climbed onto the roof herself in the dark, slipped once on the icy timber, and slammed her shoulder against the crossbeam so hard it knocked the breath out of her. She lay there for a moment on the frozen wood staring up at stars that did not care, then pulled herself up, set the plank, and drove the nails home with 3 hard swings. But the plank would not hold. The wind had bent the nail holes wider, and every time she drove a nail straight down, the gust caught the edge and worked it loose again. She lay on her stomach on the frozen roof, breathing hard, her shoulder throbbing, and for a moment she simply stopped. Not out of defeat, out of calculation. She turned the nail sideways in her fingers and remembered something James had told her once while they repaired a barn roof in a Pennsylvania rainstorm. Never drive a nail with the wind. Drive it across. The gust pulls a straight nail clean out, but an angled one digs in deeper the harder the wind blows. She angled the nail into the grain of the wood 45 degrees against the prevailing wind and swung. The head bit in and held. She drove 2 more the same way, tested the plank with her palm, and felt it solid under her hand. The wind screamed past it, and the board did not move. She climbed down into the dark alone, her shoulders swelling and her fingers numb. She did not feel proud. She felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has solved a problem that should not have been hers to solve alone. But the roof was patched, and that was what mattered. The days that followed were the loneliest Margaret had known since the trail west. December had settled over the valley with a silence that felt deliberate, as if the cold itself were listening. The knocks on her door slowed to 1 or 2 a week, and the faces that appeared on her porch came with less shame and more wariness. She noticed it in the way they held their bodies' shoulders turned slightly, away, eyes flicking toward the pantry slope, as if it were something dangerous rather than something that had kept them alive. The gratitude had curdled. She could smell it in the air between them, the way you can smell a change in the weather before the first cloud appears. One afternoon, she walked to the creek for water and passed the Denby boys on the trail. They were young, maybe 12 and 15, and they stepped off the path to let her by without speaking. The older one watched her pass with an expression she had seen before on the faces of men at the general store when they looked at the shopkeeper's wife who controlled what was left on the shelves. It was the look of someone calculating what you had and whether they could get it from you. The boy was 15 years old and already learning to see a woman not as a person, but as a resource. Margaret filled her bucket and walked back to the cabin without turning around. But she checked the pantry latch twice that night before she slept. Into this silence came a stranger. Not a new settler or a passing trader, but the old woman who lived at the far edge of the valley where the tree line met the open rock. Edna Wainwright. Nobody visited Edna, and Edna visited nobody. She was somewhere past 60, white-haired, bent at the shoulders but sharp in the eyes. The kind of woman who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by any of it. Margaret was hauling stones back to the slope one afternoon when Edna appeared on the trail, leaning on a walking stick carved for ceremony from a single branch of black walnut. She stopped and watched Margaret work without speaking for a long time. Margaret could feel the old woman's gaze on her back, steady and measuring the way a doctor studies a wound before deciding whether to stitch it or let it breathe. "You dig deep," Edna finally said. Not a question. Margaret did not look up. "Have to." Edna was quiet again. The wind moved between them. Then she spoke, her voice flat and careful, as if she were reciting something she had memorized a long time ago. "I knew a woman once who built a cellar like yours, out in Wyoming, many winters back. She kept her food while everyone else is spoiled. Fed the whole settlement through 2 months of freeze." Margaret's hands slowed on the stone but did not stop. "She didn't make it through the second winter," Edna said. Margaret looked up then. The old woman's face was unreadable, carved from years of silence and solitude. But her eyes held something that might have been concern, or might have been memory, or might have been both. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked. Edna did not answer the question. She simply turned and walked away without another word. No explanation, no farewell, just the slow tap of her walking stick on the frozen trail and the crunch of her boots growing fainter until the trees swallowed her whole. Margaret stood still for a moment, watching the old woman's crooked figure disappear between the pines. Her chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She thought about the woman in Wyoming, thought about what it meant to build something that kept you alive while everyone around you failed, and what happened when they stopped being grateful and started being afraid. Then she picked up the next stone and kept digging. The days grew shorter and the knocks grew more desperate, but something else was growing too, something quieter and more dangerous than hunger. Margaret first noticed it in the footprints. Small boot prints in the snow circling the entrance to her pantry. Not just once. She found them on a Tuesday morning, partially filled with fresh powder. Then again on Thursday from a different angle, as if someone had approached from the tree line instead of the trail. By Saturday, the tracks had been there 3 separate times from 3 separate directions, and whoever was making them had started getting closer to the stone lid each time. Noah Garrett. She was almost certain. He was 14, lanky, all sharp elbows and suspicious eyes, the kind of boy who watched everything and said nothing. She had seen him once standing behind a black pine near the creek while she hauled up a bucket of ice melt. His coat was 3 sizes too big, handed down from a father who had no use for a son who could not swing an axe as hard as he wanted. "You hungry?" Margaret had called out to him. No answer. Just those sharp eyes watching from behind the bark. "Then go home. This freeze will steal your toes before you know they're gone." He had vanished like smoke, but the footprints kept coming. Each day, a little bolder. Each set of tracks circling a little closer to the stone door. Someone was studying her pantry the way a fox studies a henhouse, learning the routine, measuring the distance, waiting for the right moment. One morning, Margaret found something new in the snow near the pantry entrance. Not just footprints this time, but finger marks on the edge of the stone lid, small and desperate, as if someone had tried to lift the cover and failed. The marks were too faint to have come from a grown man's hands. They belonged to someone young, someone without the strength to move 100 pounds of fitted stone. She knelt beside the marks and studied them. The fingers had scrabbled at the edge and slipped, leaving shallow grooves in the frost that coated the rock. Whoever had tried this had done it in the dark, probably in the hours before dawn, when the cold was worst and the hunger hardest to bear. They had come alone. They had failed. And they had walked away empty-handed back toward the Garrett property, leaving nothing behind but the evidence of their desperation. Margaret sat back on her heels and thought about the barn behind the pine tree, 14 years old, wearing a coat that did not fit, watching her with eyes that were too sharp for his age and too old for his face. She thought about what kind of father would send a child to do this kind of work, and she thought about what kind of valley would produce a father like that. She reinforced the stone lid with a second latch, one that was harder to see and harder to reach. She started carrying a hatchet tucked into her belt whenever she left the cabin. Not for show, not to threaten, just because she knew what hunger could do to a grown man, and she knew what envy could do to a boy who had been watching too long and eating too little. The evening air bit harder now. The valley had gone quiet in the way that valleys do when something is about to break. And somewhere out in the frozen dark, a boy with sharp eyes and an oversized coat was circling closer. Closer, closer to the only food that had survived the winter. Margaret checked the latch one more time, brushed the fresh snow from the stone, and went inside to wait. 3 days before Christmas, the sky turned the color of ash and the Farnham cabin burned to the ground. Nobody could say for certain whether it was the chimney or the lamp oil. Maybe it was both. What they knew was this: by the time the nearest neighbor saw the glow through the trees and came running with a bucket, the flames had already eaten through the roof and were chewing on the walls with a sound like crumpling paper. The Farnhams made it out alive, all 6 of them barefoot and screaming into the snow. But everything else was gone. The beds, the clothes, the tools, and every ounce of food they had stored for winter. Barrels of lard oats, jerky, and dried beans, all of it consumed in less than an hour. The family was moved into the old schoolhouse, where they huddled together on the bare floor under every coat and blanket the valley could spare, which was not much. Miss Alma Devlin came to Margaret's cabin the next morning. She was the school teacher, a woman of maybe 35 with a narrow face and steady hands that were trembling, now standing on Margaret's porch with tears frozen on her lashes. "I don't ask for myself," Alma said. "Just the children. The littlest one's gone pale, and her mama's not much better. They haven't eaten anything warm since the fire." Margaret went into the hillside and came back with butter. Real butter from the crock she had placed on the coldest shelf against the back wall, where the air barely moved and the temperature held steady all winter long. It was the last full crock she had. She wrapped it in burlap and placed it gently into Alma's shaking hands. "Use it quick," Margaret said. "Won't keep out there." Alma stared at the bundle as though she were holding something holy. Then she whispered a thank you that came out more like a prayer and disappeared down the trail. That butter was worth more than gold. Traded at any other time, it might have bought Margaret a full week of provisions, maybe 2. She knew at the moment she let it go. She gave it anyway. And that single act of giving was what set the fire. Not the kind that burned the Farnham cabin. A slower fire, the kind that starts in whispers and spreads through glances and quiet conversations held behind closed doors. "She's got more down there," Mrs. Cope told the shopkeeper's wife while they stood outside the boarded-up general store. "I seen the lantern glow past midnight. She's still going in and out of that hole. Who keeps butter in the ground and don't sell it? She's not starving like the rest of us. You seen her face. She looks fed. That pantry's not natural." The word traveled through the valley the way sickness travels through a crowded room. From Cope to the shopkeeper's wife. From the shopkeeper's wife to the man who ran the post. From the postman to his sister who told the Crawfords, who told the Halls. And suddenly the same neighbors who had knocked softly on Margaret's door and accepted her food with downcast eyes were now watching her hillside with something harder than curiosity. They could not explain how one woman alone with no money and no help had food that lasted when theirs had not. And what people cannot explain they learn to fear. And what they fear they find reasons to destroy. Margaret felt the change the way you feel a shift in the wind before a storm. Fewer knocks on her door, more eyes on her slope. She noticed the preacher Wesley Prescott watching from his porch across the valley one morning, not moving, just standing with his arms folded and his breath puffing into the cold air. She noticed 2 women she had fed just the week before crossing to the other side of the trail when she walked to the creek. Small things. But Margaret had spent enough years alone to know that small things were how trouble always began. It was on one of those quiet, watchful afternoons that Margaret did something she had never done before. She walked to the far edge of the valley past the last cabin, past the broken fence line, and up the narrow trail that led to Edna Wainwright's place. The old woman's cabin was barely that. More a shack built against a rock face with a chimney that leaked smoke from 3 different cracks and a door that hung crooked on leather hinges. Margaret knocked once and waited. When the door opened, Edna did not invite her in. She simply stood in the gap and looked at her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Tell me about the woman in Wyoming," Margaret said, "the one who built the cellar." Edna studied her for a long moment. Then she stepped back just enough to let Margaret through. Inside it smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, and something medicinal that Margaret could not name. Edna lowered herself into a chair near the fire and gestured at nothing, which Margaret took to mean she should stand or find her own seat. She stood. Her name was Ellie, Edna said. Her voice had the flatness of someone recounting a fact, not telling a story. She built a cellar better than yours, deeper, better sealed. She fed that settlement for 2 full months when everything else had gone to rot. They loved her for it in November. By January, they hated her, called her a witch, said she had made a deal with something unholy to keep her food while theirs spoiled. Edna paused and poked at the fire with a bent iron rod. They burned her cellar in the night, poured lamp oil down the ventilation holes and lit it. Everything she had stored was destroyed. Ellie ran into the woods because there was nowhere else to go. She froze to death 3 days later. They found her body in the spring, curled up under a pine tree with her arms wrapped around herself. The fire popped. A log shifted. Margaret said nothing. Edna looked up from the flames and fixed Margaret with a stare that was not unkind but was not gentle either. You think you're different. You think because you're tougher or smarter or more stubborn you'll outlast what's coming. But Garrett is already talking. And when a man like that starts talking, other men start listening. Not because he's right, but because he gives them permission to do what they already want to do. And what do you want me to do? Margaret asked. Run. I want you to stop pretending you can fight this alone. You're pulling trouble towards you like a magnet, and the rest of us have to live in the same valley. Leave. Go south before the pass closes for good. Let me die in peace. Margaret looked at Edna's hands resting on her knees. They were gnarled and spotted with age, but the fingers were still precise, still steady. The hands of a woman who had once stitched men back together on a battlefield and had not flinched at the screaming. I'm not Ellie, Margaret said quietly, and I don't run. Edna shook her head. Then you'll die here. Margaret stood, buttoned her coat, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the crooked frame. Maybe, she said, but I'll die standing. She stepped into the snow and did not look back. 2 days later, she found fresh tracks again near the pantry entrance. But this time they were accompanied by something else. A second set of prints, larger, heavier, belonging to someone who wore proper boots with a square heel. An adult. The larger tracks stayed back near the tree line as if whoever made them had stood and watched while the smaller boots circled the stone lid. Then both sets of tracks headed south together back toward the Garrett property. Dalton Garrett was sending his boy to scout. Margaret reinforced the latch that evening and said nothing to anyone. It was Chet Boone who told her what was really happening. She found him on a freezing evening outside his forge, which had been closed for weeks because there was no coal left to feed it. He was sitting on an upturned anvil with an empty bottle at his feet and his coat hanging open as though he had forgotten what coal was. His face was wet and not from the snow. Margaret almost walked past. She had no business with the blacksmith and no interest in a drunk man's sorrow. But something made her stop. Maybe it was the way his shoulders shook. Maybe it was the fact that he was the only person in the valley who had ever warned her about anything. Boone, she said. He looked up with red eyes that struggled to focus. Then he laughed a short, bitter sound. Come to watch the fool freeze pull up a chair. I don't have time for this. No, he agreed, you don't, because Garrett's coming for you and you don't even know why. Margaret stood still. Chet wiped his face with the back of his hand and stared at the empty forge as if it owed him something. He was an officer, Chet said. His voice was slurred, but his eyes had sharpened the way a drunk man's eyes sharpen when he is finally telling the truth he has been carrying too long. In Kansas, Army, his unit got ambushed at a creek crossing, and Garrett gave the order to hold position instead of pulling back. 12 men died. 12. The Army didn't court-martial him, but they stripped his rank and sent him home. Chet picked up the empty bottle, looked at it, set it down again. Since then, he can't stand it. Can't stand anyone being in control of anything he's not in charge of. He calls it protecting people, keeping order, making sure nobody dies on his watch again. But what it really is a man so eaten up by guilt that he has to control everything around him just to sleep at night. And right now, the thing he can't control is you. What's he planning? Margaret asked. I don't know exactly when, but I know he's been talking to Ward and some of the others. Talking about how it's not right that one woman has food while families starve. Talking about fairness and sharing and the common good, all words that sound noble until you realize what he really means is that he wants to take what's yours and hand it out himself so everyone owes him instead of you. Chet looked at her directly for the first time. I owe him money, cattle iron, everything in that forge. He'll expect me to stand with him when the time comes. And God help me, I might be too much of a coward to say no. Margaret absorbed this in silence. Then she asked, why are you telling me? Chet's jaw worked. Because my father was a good man and he'd have torn my hide off if he knew I sat here and let this happen without saying a word. He turned away after that, and Margaret left him sitting in the cold with his empty bottle and his father's ghost. 2 days later, Dalton Garrett appeared at her door. He arrived mid-morning, hat-in-hand, pistol on his belt, wearing that careful smile she had seen on the faces of men who were about to sell you something rotten. His cheeks were not red from the wind. No frost crusted his collar. He had not walked far, which meant he knew exactly where her cabin was, which meant he had been watching and had chosen his moment. Heard you might have taken in my boy, he said, his voice easy and smooth. He glanced past her shoulder into the dark cabin. Margaret said nothing. She had not taken in Noah Garrett. She had not even seen him up close since the day at the creek. Wife's worried, Dalton went on. We thought he might have wandered in the storm. You know how boys are. I haven't seen him, Margaret said. It was the truth. Dalton nodded, but his eyes did not believe her muffin. They moved past her to the slope behind the cabin to the sealed stone entrance and lingered there. That's quite a thing you built, he said. Real clever. Got the whole valley talking. Folks say it's the only reason half of us are still alive down here. Margaret waited. His voice dropped lower. A lot of mouths to feed, and winter's only half done. You've been generous, I'll grant you that. But generosity with conditions isn't generosity, it's power. And one woman shouldn't have that kind of power over a whole valley. I've never kept food from anyone who came asking with honesty, Margaret said. You make that sound noble, but it's pride all the same. You give when it suits you. You decide who eats and who doesn't. We need more than scraps from your table, widow. We need to share in it properly. You mean take it? I mean stop pretending one woman with a shovel gets to survive while other people's children go hungry. Margaret leaned against the doorframe. She looked at Dalton Garrett and saw two things at once: the face of a man who believed he was saving his community and the face of a man who could not tolerate anyone holding something he did not control. I've got 4 families ready to back me, he continued. You give us half the stores, we forget the whole business. You keep your cabin, you keep half your food, that's fair. You come back with those men, Margaret said, and you'll walk home alone. She closed the door in his face. She did not watch him leave. Heard the boots on packed snow, the steady crunch growing softer as he moved down the slope. Hours later, through a crack in the shutter, she saw him crossing toward the Ward property. Then the Munns. Then as dusk fell, 6 figures gathering at the edge of the schoolhouse, silhouettes against the firelight, their breath rising into the cold like a signal. She had a day, maybe 2. That night she could not sleep. She sat by the fire while the wind pressed against the walls, and sometime after midnight she took the lantern and went down into the pantry. She needed to count, needed to know the exact number. She went hook by hook, shelf by shelf, crock by crock. The numbers kept getting smaller. She had been giving food away for weeks, sometimes twice a day, and the stores that had seemed so generous in November now looked thin and fragile under the lamplight. She did the calculation in her head. At the current rate, she had enough for herself until mid-February. But if she kept feeding others, if anyone else knocked, if anything else went wrong, she would run out before the end of January. For everyone, including herself. And there alone in the cold stone dark with the weight of the earth pressing down above her and the smell of preserved food and damp rock filling her lungs, Margaret Hollis did something she had not done since the night James died. She put her back against the wall, slid down until she was sitting on the stone floor, pressed her forehead against her knees and wept. Not loud, not dramatic, just the slow shaking kind of crying that comes when a person has been standing too long and holding too much and there is no one left to share the weight. She cried because she was tired, because she had given and no one had ever once asked if she was all right, because she had built this place with her own bleeding hands and it still might not be enough. Then she stopped, wiped her face with the heel of her hand, climbed back up the stairs, sealed the stone, sat by the fire, and no one ever knew. The blood appeared on the morning of January 3rd. Margaret woke before dawn to a silence that felt wrong. She dressed quickly and opened the back door to check the pantry entrance the way she did every morning now. The stone lid had been shifted, not removed but lifted an inch on one side as if someone had tried to pry it open and then lost their grip or their nerve. A smear of red was visible on the edge of the stone, bright against the gray. And in the snow leading away from the pantry and into the tree line, a trail of small, uneven footprints dotted with blood. They did not lead toward any cabin. They led into the woods, into the deep cold and the dark pines where no settler in their right mind went in January. Margaret stood above the tracks with the wind biting her cheeks. She checked the pantry. Nothing was missing. Every hook still full, every jar sealed, every rack undisturbed. Whoever had tried to open the door had fled before taking anything. She should have sealed the stone and gone back inside. No food was gone, no harm was done. But the footprints were too small to belong to a grown man, and the blood trail was sloppy and erratic. The pattern of someone stumbling, someone not thinking clearly, someone young. She put on her heaviest coat, wrapped her scarf tight, pulled on the mended gloves, and tucked 2 biscuits into her pocket. Not because she planned to be gone long, but because she knew what it meant when someone disappeared into these woods in the dead of winter. They would not last the night. She followed the trail without telling anyone because she knew exactly what the neighbors would say. Let him freeze. Let him learn. She owed them nothing after what they had done, but something in her would not allow her to turn back. The part that had once held a dead child to her chest on a frozen trail. The part that had built a pantry with fingers numb from grief. That part did not care about fairness or debts. It only knew that the tracks were small, and the cold was deep, and the blood was still wet. The prince weaved through the woods, crossed a narrow frozen creek, twice looped back, near a downed birch tree, then continued deeper. Half a mile in, Margaret found a scarf caught in a snowdrift. Brown wool with red edging, handmade old. She knew it immediately. She picked up her pace. The tracks grew closer together, the strides shortening, the left foot dragging. The blood had stopped, which meant either the wound had frozen shut or something worse. Then she saw it. A small lean-to made of brush and sticks, barely standing, more like a pile of debris that had accidentally formed the shape of shelter. A thin line of smoke rose from a hollowed stump near the base. She crouched low, hatchet in hand, and called out softly. Noah! Silence. Then a cough. Weak, childish surprise. Ms. Margaret, I'm here. You're not in trouble. He came out slowly, wrapped in a thin blanket that was stiff with frost. His cheeks were raw, his lips cracked white, and one hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth already soaked through with dark blood. The other hand held an empty tin cup, as if he had forgotten to put it down. I didn't take nothing, he said, and his voice broke on the last word. Didn't even eat. I just wanted to see if it was real. Then I saw Pa watching from the trees, so I ran. I thought he could not finish. Margaret crouched beside him and took his hand carefully. The cut was shallow but ragged, the kind made by catching a nail or a rough edge of stone in the dark. Half frozen, caked with grit. Painful but survivable if it was cleaned. You'll lose the fingers if you stay out here, she said. I can't go back. Why not? He looked at her then, and his eyes were glassy. Not from cold, from shame. They said it was my fault, that I told people about your place, that I got others jealous. Pa hit me, said I should have broken in before it got sealed again, said I should have taken something to prove it was real. When I wouldn't do it, he told me I wasn't his son. Margaret inhaled slowly. They sent you to steal from me. Noah shook his head, then stopped because shaking his head was a lie and he knew it. Pa said I should fix what I started. Get in and back out. Nobody has to know. When I couldn't do it, when I cut my hand and panicked, I just ran. Figured I'd go for a day or two, let him cool off, maybe find a trapper's trail heading south. It's not going to get warmer, Margaret said. I know. Did you tell anyone you were leaving? No. That was the first good news she had heard all winter. She took him back, not because he deserved it, not because she had forgiven anything, but because she knew what it meant to be alone in the cold with a body too small to fight back and hands too raw to hold anything. She gave him 1 biscuit from her coat pocket as they walked, told him not to talk. He did not. When they reached the cabin, she brought him inside, stripped off his frozen outer coat, and rubbed his hands between hers until the circulation started coming back. He flinched and bit down hard when the blood began to move again, but he did not cry. Not once. She cleaned the wound on his hand with warm water and a strip of clean linen, working carefully around the edges where the cold had turned the skin white and waxy. The boy watched her hands as she worked, and she could feel him studying her the way he had studied the pantry entrance, from behind the trees with that same intense, searching attention, Except now it was not suspicion in his eyes, but something closer to disbelief. As if he could not understand why a woman he had tried to rob was now tending to his wounds. Why, he asked so quietly she almost missed it. Margaret did not look up from the bandage. Because I've been cold too, she said, and nobody came. It was the most she had ever said about herself to anyone in the valley, and she regretted it immediately, not because it was untrue, but because it opened a door she had spent years keeping shut. She tied off the bandage and stood up. You'll sleep in the loft, she said. You'll eat what I give you. No wandering, no questions. You so much as look at that pantry without my say-so, and I'll put you back in the snow myself. He nodded with wide eyes and said nothing. She believed him, but she slept with her boots on and the hatchet by the bed just the same. For 3 nights, the boy barely moved. He ate what she gave him, stayed in the loft, and kept his eyes down. On the 4th morning, a knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps. Too confident for a neighbor begging. Too casual for someone desperate. Margaret opened the door slowly. Dalton Garrett stood on the porch, hat in hand, gun on his belt, that carved smile on his face. I know you have my boy, he said. Margaret met his eyes and did not step back. He's resting. You know I've got every right to take my son home. You had that right before you sent him out to freeze for your pride. Dalton's jaw tightened. He leaned to one side, trying to see past her into the cabin. Then he straightened and looked toward the slope. Impressive what you built, he said. Really is. But you know what I think? I think you're sitting on enough food to last 3 families through spring, and you're handing out crumbs so people feel grateful instead of angry. That's not kindness. That's control. That's a strange accusation, Margaret said, from a man who sent a child to do his stealing. Something shifted in Dalton's face. The mask cracked for just a moment, and what was underneath was not anger, but a flash of old pain. The kind that comes from remembering something you cannot undo. His eyes went distant for a breath, and Margaret saw him somewhere else entirely. Somewhere flat and dusty, where the screaming had not stopped in time. His hand moved to his belt, not for the pistol, but for something that was not there, a gesture that belonged to another life, another uniform, another version of the man who now stood on her porch demanding food he had not earned. Then grow your own food, Margaret said. Build your own cellar. Do the work. We don't have time for that. We have now. And right now, you have what we need. You come back with your men, Margaret said, and you'll walk home alone. She closed the door. That night, long after Dalton's boot prints had been covered by fresh snow, Margaret stood at the window and watched the valley. She could see him moving between cabins in the fading light, stopping at the halls, then the munns, then gathering with shadows at the schoolhouse. 6 men, maybe more. She had a day, maybe less. At 2 in the morning, the knock came so soft she almost missed it. She took the hatchet and cracked the door open. Chet Boone stood on the porch, face white as paper, hands shaking, but his eyes were the clearest she had ever seen them, stone sober. Tomorrow night, he whispered. They're using Mrs. Munn as a decoy. She'll come to your front door with the children crying, asking for help. While you let them in, Garrett and Ward go around back to the pantry. They'll have the stone up before you know they're there. Margaret gripped the hatchet tighter. And you? I'm not going. I told Garrett my back gave out. He doesn't believe me, but he doesn't need me either. He's got enough. Why are you here, Boone? He looked at the ground. Because my father would have come, and I've spent too long being less of a man than he was. He turned to leave, then stopped without looking back. I was never here. You never heard any of this. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark and the falling snow. Margaret closed the door and stood in the silence of her cabin, listening to the wind and the faint sound of Noah breathing in the loft above. She had less than 20 hours. She woke the boy. Get up, she said. We have work to do. They worked until their fingers cracked and bled. First, she rigged the pantry lid with a second interior latch that could only be opened from inside. Then she moved half the remaining stores down into a hidden space beneath the pantry floor, a crawl space barely 2 feet high that she had dug months ago and never told anyone about, concealed under a false layer of floorboards and gravel. The rest she packed into canvas sacks and stowed beneath the cabin in the crawl space between the joists. When they were done, the pantry shelves and hooks were completely bare. Empty, as if there had never been any food there at all. Let them think it's empty, Margaret told Noah. Desperate men don't look carefully. If they open it and find nothing, it buys us time. Time for what? To find out what they're willing to burn for a lie. She set the traps next. Wire stretched across the slope, buried under loose snow. Sharpened sticks angled just enough to punch through a boot sole. Bells made from fishing line and iron scraps strung through the brush at knee height. And at the entrance to the pantry itself, balanced on the edge of the stone lip, a clay pot filled with ash, coarse salt, and the small sack of black powder she had traded from a trapper 2 winters ago. Not enough to kill, enough to burn, enough to scare, enough to make them remember. Louisa Phelps, the young widow with the twins who had been staying in Margaret's cabin for 3 days, now watched all of this without speaking. She had arrived at Margaret's door the week before, half frozen, carrying 2 babies wrapped in a single blanket that was more holes than fabric. Her husband had died of a fever on the trail 3 weeks before they reached the valley. She had buried him herself on the side of a mountain road with a shovel borrowed from a stranger who did not offer to help dig. Margaret had recognized something in the way Louisa held the babies tight against her chest, jaw set, eyes dry, as if crying were a luxury she had already spent and could not afford again. It was the same way Margaret had held her own child on the trail west, and the recognition had been enough. She opened her door without being asked twice. Now Louisa watched Margaret rig traps in the snow and did not flinch. When Margaret finally looked at her, Louisa asked only one question. "What do I do?" "Keep those babies quiet. No matter what you hear, you do not open that door." Louisa nodded. Her jaw was set and her eyes were dry. Noah picked up the hammer without being asked. "What about me?" Margaret looked at him, 14 years old, thin as a fence rail, hands still bandaged, eyes that had aged 10 years in a week. "If anyone comes through the front door who isn't me," she said, "you swing." The storm arrived after dark. Wind battered the shutters hard enough to rattle the nails. Ice stripped branches from the trees with sounds like rifle shots. Somewhere in the valley, a pine cracked and fell, and the echo rolled down the hills. Margaret sat by the hearth with her back against the stone wall. The hatchet lay across her knees. The unloaded rifle leaned against the doorframe, looking deadly enough in the dim light. Noah sat beside her, not speaking, not sleeping, just watching the door with dark eyes that did not blink. The fire burned low, the wind screamed, the hours crawled. And just before dawn, when the sky was still black and the snow was still falling sideways in sheets of white, the bells began to ring. 3 rings, then silence, then the soft, deliberate crunch of boots on frozen ground. Margaret lowered the lantern flame until the cabin went dark as a cellar. The only light came from the hearth, guttering low, throwing their shadows tall and twisted across the plank walls. Noah was already moving. He slid off the bench without a sound, dropped to the floor, and crawled to the hidden hatch beneath the rug. Margaret lifted the edge, and the boy slipped between the joists into the crawl space below the cabin, where the canvas sacks of food sat packed tight against the frozen earth. She dropped the rug back into place and pushed the bench over it. In the dim light, it looked like nothing at all. Louisa Phelps sat in the far corner with a twin pressed against each shoulder, her hands covering their ears, her eyes locked on Margaret. She did not ask what was happening. She knew. Another footstep outside, closer now, not on the slope, on the porch. The knock was polite, 2 quick taps. A woman's voice, thin and trembling. "Miss Margaret, please, I brought the children." "Hazel Munn." Margaret recognized her immediately. The waver in the voice, the particular way she said please, stretching it out as if the word itself might buy her something. Margaret had heard that voice before, asking for turnips, asking for salt. But tonight it sounded different. Tonight it sounded rehearsed. She opened the door just enough to see. Hazel stood on the porch in a soaked shawl, 2 small children pressed against her skirt. The boy's ears were wrapped in wool scarves. The girl's hair was matted flat against her head. All 3 of them shaking. No one else was visible, but the skin on the back of Margaret's neck prickled the way it always did before something went wrong. She opened the door wider. "Get inside." Hazel hesitated for half a breath, then rushed forward, pushing the children ahead of her. They stumbled over the threshold and collapsed near the hearth, drawn to the warmth without needing to be told. Louisa pulled them close without a word, folding them in with her own twins, 4 small bodies pressed together in a tangle of cold limbs and shallow breathing. Margaret closed the door and dropped the bar into place. Hazel turned to face her. Her lips were trembling and her eyes were wet, and she looked like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff she had already jumped from. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "They said if I could just get you to open the door, they'd only take what was fair. They said nobody would get hurt. I didn't have a choice. Munn's too sick to work, and my children haven't eaten since." She did not finish. She did not need to. The crash came from behind the cabin. The slope. The bells screamed all at once, a jangling chorus of iron and wire that cut through the wind. then the heavy groan of the stone lid being forced, then boots skidding on frozen ground, then the particular silence that comes when men realize they have committed to something they cannot undo. Margaret did not hesitate. She grabbed the lantern, lit it full, hauled the bar from the front door, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall of needles. Snow drove sideways, thick and stinging, and the world beyond the lantern's reach was nothing but white noise and darkness. She rounded the corner of the cabin and raised the light high. 3 men were crouched at the entrance to the slope. The stone lid had been pried off and lay tilted against the hillside. The false floor of the pantry was exposed, and even from 10 feet away, Margaret could see what they saw: empty shelves, bare hooks, and nothing but cold air rising from the hole. The elder ward was on his knees reaching into the opening with both arms sweeping the empty racks as if the food might be hiding behind them. Dalton Garrett stood above him, and when the lantern light hit his face, his expression shifted from concentration to surprise to something that looked almost like admiration. "Thought you'd hidden it better," he said, "but I figured even you weren't cold enough to keep children locked down there." "I hid the food," Margaret said, "not the heart." He smiled at that. A thin, joyless thing. "Well, that's fine. You can hand it over now or we take it ourselves. Either way, you're done pretending." The third man stood slightly back from the others, a younger man Margaret recognized as one of the settlers from the north end of the valley. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Margaret planted her feet in the snow and held the lantern steady. "You're standing on a dead woman's property, Garrett, uninvited, in the middle of the night, with your hands on my stone, and you want to talk about fairness." Dalton took a step toward her. "I want to talk about survival." That was when the trap triggered. The elder ward's weight on the false floor shifted the support beam underneath, and the thin plank she had rigged as a lever snapped free. The wire attached to it pulled taut across the entry chute, and the clay pot balanced on the stone lip tipped forward and shattered against the inside wall of the pantry. The mixture of ash salt and black powder spilled across the opening in a gray cloud, and when it met the spark from the iron scraps she had wedged into the stone joint, it caught. The ignition was not an explosion. It was a rush, a sudden bright flare of heat and black smoke that poured upward from the pantry entrance like a furnace door thrown open. The flame caught the edge of Dalton Garrett's coat sleeve and climbed up his arm in a streak of orange. He howled, staggered backward. His arms windmilled against the smoke and the sudden searing pain, and he dropped to his knees in the snow, slapping at the burning fabric with his bare hands. The elder ward dove sideways with a scream that was half surprise and half animal terror. He scrambled on all fours across the frozen ground, away from the slope, away from the fire, away from the woman standing in the storm, holding a lantern in one hand and an unloaded rifle in the other. Margaret raised the rifle to her shoulder. The barrel was steady, her voice was steadier. "Leave, now." Dalton rolled in the snow, smothering the flames. His coat was scorched black from the wrist to the elbow, and the skin beneath it was already blistering. He got to his feet, slowly breathing hard, his eyes fixed on Margaret with something that was no longer contempt or calculation, but raw, unfiltered shock. He had not expected this. He had expected a woman alone. He had expected weakness. The elder ward was already running his footprints, punching deep holes in the snow as he crashed through the brush toward the tree line. The third man stood frozen, chest heaving, his mouth open, and his eyes wide, and Margaret turned the rifle toward him. He did not wait. He turned and followed Ward into the dark. Dalton lingered. He stood in the snow with his burned arm cradled against his chest, the wind tearing at his scorched coat, and he looked at Margaret for a long moment. His mouth moved as if to say something, a threat perhaps, or an apology, or simply the name of the thing he had lost. But no sound came out. The silence between them was louder than the storm. Then he turned and walked away, leaving nothing behind but boot prints filling slowly with snow and the sharp smell of burned wool dissolving into the wind. The flames at the pantry entrance guttered and died. The charge had been small, by design meant to blind and scatter, not to destroy. Margaret inspected the stone and the entry chute in the lantern light, scorched but intact. The slope was safe and everything beneath it was untouched. She went back inside. Hazel Munn was sitting on the floor near the hearth with her arms around her knees and tears running freely down her face. She looked up when Margaret entered and started speaking fast, the words tumbling over each other. "He told me if I didn't help, he'd make sure my family was shut out when the food got divided. He said nobody would get hurt. He said you had more than enough and you were hoarding it while people died, and I couldn't watch my children." I know, Margaret said. She set the rifle against the wall and crouched down until she was eye level with Hazel. I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at the man who made you a weapon. Hazel stared at her. Then she nodded slowly, and something in her face broke open, not into more tears, but into a kind of exhausted relief, the look of a woman who had expected punishment and received understanding instead. Inside, Margaret said, all of you, stay the night. We'll sort the rest in the morning. The children had already curled up by the fire. Louisa was sitting among them with her twins in her lap and the Munn children tucked against her sides, all of them tangled together in a heap of small bodies and borrowed warmth. Noah emerged from beneath the floorboards, dusty and pale, and settled himself near the door without being asked, the hammer still in his hand. Nobody spoke. The fire crackled. The wind found the cracks in the walls and whistled through them, and Margaret sat down in her chair and closed her eyes for the first time in 2 days. She did not sleep, but she rested. For a full week, no one came near Margaret's land. The snow covered the boot prints and the scorch marks and the blood that Dalton had dripped on the stone. The valley went silent. No knocks on the door, no smoke trails from neighboring chimneys visible through the trees. It was as if the entire community had retreated into itself, ashamed and afraid in equal measure. Margaret used the quiet to tend to the children. She washed their frostbitten fingers with warm water and clean rags. She fed them from the stores she had hidden, small meals cooked slow over the fire, stretching what remained with care. At night, she told them stories, not fairy tales, practical stories, stories about the land and the seasons and how to read the sky before a storm. The Munn children listened with their mouths open. Louisa's twins were too young to understand the words, but old enough to understand the warmth of a voice in the dark. Noah did not sleep in the crawl space anymore. He had moved to a spot near the hearth where he could see both the door and the back window at the same time. He spent his days quietly sharpening sticks into kindling, mending a broken handle on the water bucket, sweeping the floor without being told. He did not speak much, but when Margaret gave him a task, he completed it with a precision that surprised her. You're not going back, she told him one evening while the fire popped and the children slept. He looked at her. I know. He did not argue, did not ask what would happen next, just accepted it the way a person accepts the ground beneath their feet as something solid and final and not up for discussion. 8 days after the raid, a knock came that Margaret did not recognize. Soft but steady, patient. She picked up the hatchet and opened the door. Edna Wainwright stood on the porch, bundled in a coat that looked older than she was, holding a canvas bag with both hands. It was the first time Margaret had seen her leave her cabin since before Christmas. Her face was raw from the walk, and her breathing was labored, but her eyes were clear and sharp and aimed directly at Margaret. Brought medicine, Edna said, for the boy's hand. If you don't clean that wound properly, he'll lose the fingers by February. Margaret looked at the bag, then at Edna. You told me to leave. I did. You said I'd die here. I said that too. Edna paused. I was wrong about the dying part. You're still standing. That counts for something. Margaret stepped aside and Edna entered the cabin. It was the first time the old woman had been inside another person's home in years, and she moved through the space with the cautious efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. She found Noah by the hearth, unwrapped his bandaged hand without asking permission, and examined the wound under the firelight. Her fingers were gentle but sure, pressing along the edges of the cut, testing for heat and swelling. Not infected yet, she said, but it's heading that way. Another 2 days and we'd be having a different conversation. She opened the canvas bag and pulled out a small clay jar of salve, strips of clean linen, and a bottle of something that smelled like turpentine and burned herbs. She cleaned the wound with movements that were practiced and precise, the muscle memory of a woman who had spent years stitching soldiers back together and knew the difference between a wound that would heal and one that would not. Noah winced once but did not pull away. Edna wrapped the hand in fresh linen, tied it off, and sat back. Change the dressing every morning, she told Margaret. Keep it dry, and make him eat something with fat in it. The body needs fuel to repair itself. Margaret nodded. Then she asked the question she had been holding since the day Edna told her about Wyoming. You said Ellie died because she fought alone and refused to trust anyone. What changed your mind about me? Edna looked at Noah, then at Louisa and the children sleeping near the fire, then back at Margaret. Ellie never let anyone inside, Edna said. Not her cellar, not her cabin, not her life. She fed people through a crack in the door and never once opened it all the way. You opened yours. You let the boy in. That's the difference. She stood and pulled her coat tight. I'm not saying you're safe. I'm saying you might survive. And that's more than I've said about anyone in this valley since November. She left without saying goodbye, walking back into the cold with that steady, careful gait, and Margaret watched her go with something loosening in her chest that she could not name, but did not fight. The confrontation came at the end of January. Dalton Garrett appeared in the center of the valley on a gray afternoon, standing in front of the schoolhouse with his burned arm wrapped in a sling made from a flour sack. He had gathered the last of his supporters, which amounted to the elder Ward and two other men who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. He was making his case one more time, loud enough for anyone within earshot to hear. "She's hoarding food while families starve," Dalton declared, his voice carrying across the frozen ground. "She decides who eats and who doesn't. No one woman should have that power. We need a fair share, a common store, something that belongs to everyone, not just to whoever built the deepest hole." A small crowd had gathered, not by invitation, but by the gravity of raised voices in a valley where people had been whispering for weeks. They stood in loose clusters, arms crossed, breath fogging, waiting to see what would happen next. Louisa Phelps stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. She was carrying one of the twins on her hip. The other was with Hazel Munn, who stood behind Louisa with a look on her face that suggested she had made a decision and was terrified of it. Louisa was not a large woman. She was thin from hunger and young enough to be Dalton Garrett's daughter. But she walked toward him with her back straight and her chin up and her eyes fixed on his face without blinking. "You talk about community," Louisa said, and her voice was clear and calm and carried just as far as his. "You talk about fairness and the common good. But I've been in this valley for 5 weeks now, Mr. Garrett, and I've seen what you do. You sent your own son into the woods to freeze because he wouldn't steal for you. You used a mother and her children as bait so you could rob a woman in the middle of the night. And you burned your own arm trying to take food from the one person who's been feeding you since November. That's not leadership. That's not protection. That's a man who can't stand the idea that someone else did something he couldn't." The valley went quiet. The wind itself seemed to pause. Dalton stared at Louisa, his jaw tightened, his good hand clenched at his side. He looked past her at the faces in the crowd, searching for allies, for nods, for anything that would tell him he still held the ground. Miss Alma Devlin stepped forward and stood beside Louisa. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was the statement. Then Chet Boone came forward. He walked slowly, his head down, his shoulders hunched, as though the act of standing in the open was physically painful. But he walked. And when he reached Louisa's side, he stopped and raised his head and looked directly at Dalton for the first time since the raid. He did not say a word. His face said everything. Ada Prescott came next. Then Hazel Munn, trembling but upright. Then the old man with one eye who fixed broken tools. Then two other women Margaret had never spoken to. One by one they moved to Louisa's side of the clearing, not with anger or defiance, but with the quiet, heavy certainty of people who had finally decided where they stood. Dalton looked at the group in front of him, then at the two men behind him who would not meet his eyes. His burned arm hung in its sling. His face was the face of a man watching the last of something drain away. He did not speak. He did not argue or threaten or make promises. He simply turned and walked back toward his cabin, and the sound of his boots on the frozen ground was the loneliest sound the valley had heard all winter. By mid-February, the Garrett cabin was empty. Dalton had packed what he could carry and left before dawn on a morning so cold the hinges on his door had frozen shut and he had to kick it open to get out. The elder Ward left the same week his family loaded onto a wagon that looked too heavy for the horses pulling it. They went south toward the warmer valleys, leaving behind cabins that stood like hollow teeth against the gray sky. No one said goodbye. No one tried to stop them. The valley exhaled. Others came to Margaret slowly after that. Not to beg, to work. Miss Alma arrived first, asking not for food, but for a shovel. Edna came next, carrying her medicine bag and a determination that showed in every step. The old man with one eye brought a wagon full of broken tools and the knowledge of how to fix them. Louisa was already there, already part of whatever was forming her twins, growing fat on boiled turnips and the warmth of a cabin that had somehow become a home for more people than it was built for. And Noah. Noah, who had stopped being a boy somewhere between the night he ran into the forest and the morning he picked up the hammer without being asked. He did not ask if Margaret was sending him away. That question had dissolved on its own, replaced by something sturdier and more permanent, the understanding that he belonged here now, not because anyone had said so, but because he had earned it. "Get the shovels." Margaret told him one morning in early March, when the snow had begun to pull back from the hillsides and the first pale light of a longer day stretched across the valley. He did not ask why. He just went. By summer, the settlement had grown. 3 more families, a handful of single men, 2 other widows, a trapper with frostbitten hands who could no longer hold a rifle but could still stack stone with an accuracy that bordered on artistry. They did not form a town. There was no charter, no sign, no proper name. But there was a communal fire pit where people brought stew or salted fish in the evenings. There were children running along trails where wolves had walked just months before. There was the sound of hammering and sawing, and voices raised not in argument, but in the ordinary noise of people building something together. Margaret's pantry was not hidden anymore. The stone lid sat open most days during the warm months, airing out the chamber, keeping it clean and cool. A few jars of salt and lard remained on the back shelf for emergencies, but the pantry itself had become something else now. Not storage, a landmark, a reminder. People who came through the valley for the first time always asked about it, and someone would point to the slope behind the cabin and say, "That's where it started." They came to Margaret for the new pantries. Every family wanted their own, and she taught them. Not for money, not for trade, just with the same plain voice she used for everything, standing at the edge of a fresh hole in the ground while someone else did the digging. Line it with rock, not just logs. 2 vent holes, not 1. Slope your ceiling or it'll drip by December. And don't ever put meat on the bottom shelf. She said it once. She did not explain why. They listened because she had lived it, and that was the only credential that mattered out here. The morning Margaret taught Noah to fix the roof was the morning she understood what she had been building all along. The same plank that had blown loose last winter had loosened again, the nails worked out by months of freeze and thaw. This time Margaret did not climb up alone in the dark. She stood at the base of the ladder and sent Noah up with the hammer and a handful of nails. "Angle them into the wind," she called up, "not straight down. The gust will pull a straight nail out inside a month." He drove the first one wrong, pulled it out, drove the second one at an angle, the head biting into the grain the way she had shown him. It held. "Good," she said. That single word carried more weight than she intended. Noah paused on the roof and looked down at her, and something passed between them that neither of them named. It was the same thing that had passed between Margaret and James on the day he first showed her how to read the seam in a stone. The handing down of knowledge. The quiet act of making sure that what you learn does not die with you. For the first time, the memory of James did not ache. It was simply useful. And Margaret realized that all of this, the pantry, the teaching the boy on the roof with a hammer, was what survival actually looked like. Not holding on alone, but passing it forward. In late autumn, Noah finished building the second pantry. It was deeper than Margaret's original, with room enough for 2 families' worth of provisions. He had built it with a boy named Caleb and Louisa Phelps, working side by side for 3 weeks, arguing about stone placement and ventilation angles, the way people argue about things that matter. By the time they sealed the ceiling, the 3 of them were laughing together like cousins at a family gathering. And Margaret stood at the threshold watching them and feeling something she had not felt in so long, she almost did not recognize it. Pride, not the hard, lonely kind she had carried through the winter. Something softer. The kind that comes from watching someone you believed in become someone who believes in themselves. She tested the door. It sealed clean, tighter than her first one ever had. "Well," Noah asked. "It'll hold." He smiled. Not like a boy, not quite like a man, like someone who understood what it meant to build something that could keep another person alive. They held the first pantry supper in late summer, gathered around the communal fire pit on an evening when the sky turned pink and orange and the air smelled like pine sap and wood smoke. Every dish came from something preserved. Dried venison, pickled beets, smoked fish cornbread made from meal that had been stored through the warm months in a cellar that Caleb had built himself. No fresh harvest yet, but preserved life. That was the point. Margaret sat on a log near the fire and watched the faces in the light. Children carrying jars, men comparing whose beans had lasted longer. A woman missing 2 fingers playing a mouth harp under the stars. Edna sat beside her silent for a long time, wrapped in a shawl that smelled like dried sage. "Ellie would have liked this," Edna said finally. Margaret did not ask who she meant. She knew. "I built the pantry for myself," she said. "It became theirs before I planned it." Edna nodded. The best things always do. Someone passed Margaret a plate. She did not ask what was on it. She ate slowly, tasting each bite, and the flavor was not turnips or salt pork or anything she could name. It tasted like the end of something and the beginning of something else, and they were both the same thing. Chet Boone came to her cabin on a bright morning in September. He was sober. Margaret could tell the moment she saw him because his eyes were clear and his back was straight, and he carried himself with a steadiness she had never seen in him before. He had a bundle of split firewood strapped to his horse, and he unloaded it without speaking, stacking the logs neatly against the wall of her porch in rows so even they could have been measured. Margaret watched from the doorway. When he finished, she said, "You don't owe me anything, Boone." He paused with he back to her. His hands rested on the last log he had placed, and he stood there for a moment, without moving, the morning light catching the gray in his hair. "I know," he said, "but I owe myself." Then he mounted his horse and rode back down the trail, and Margaret noticed that his shoulders were squared and his head was up, and he looked for the first time like a man his father would have recognized. The first snow of the new season came light and early, a thin dusting that whitened the ground by morning and melted by noon. But the message was clear. Winter was coming again, and this time the valley was ready. Every cabin had a sloped patch of earth behind it now. Not every pantry was perfect. Some had ventilation holes that were slightly too wide. Some had ceilings that would probably drip by December. One of them had been dug so deep that the builder had struck the water table and had to fill it back in and start over. But they existed, every single one, and that meant something. Noah stood on the ridge above the valley on a cold afternoon in late October, and Margaret climbed up to meet him. They had gone to check the tree line for signs of bear activity before the dens closed for winter, but they had stopped at the top and ended up just standing there looking out across the land below. The cabins looked small from up there, fragile even, but each one had smoke rising from its chimney. Each one had a cleared patch of earth behind it where stone and timber met the slope. Each one had someone inside who knew how to keep food through a freeze because someone had taught them, and that someone had been taught by a dead man who had never lived to see what his knowledge would build. "I think it'll hold," Noah asked. "All this—" Margaret did not look at him. She looked at the valley, at the thin columns of smoke, at the children she could just barely see playing near the fire pit, small figures moving against the white ground. "If the earth holds," she said, "then so will we." Noah was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed against them steady and cold, carrying the first real bite of the coming season. What if another storm comes? It will. That was not pessimism. It was fact. Storms always came. The mountains guaranteed it. The only question that mattered was whether you were ready when they arrived. Margaret had answered that question once alone, with nothing but a shovel and a dead man's lessons. Now there were 20 shovels in the valley, and none of them were alone. They walked back down in silence, and the light faded behind the ridge, and the valley settled into the blue-gray quiet of a late autumn evening. Somewhere below, a child laughed. A door opened and closed. The smell of cooking drifted up the slope on the cold air. That night, just before the deep winter returned for good, Margaret went to check the pantry one last time. She walked the familiar path behind her cabin, brushed the snow from the stone lid, and was about to turn back when she noticed something she had not seen before. A folded piece of canvas tucked behind the hinge of the door, tied with a length of rough twine. She untied it carefully and unfolded it under the lantern light. Inside was a drawing, done in charcoal and boot polish, crude but careful, the work of a hand that lacked skill but not feeling. It showed a cabin on a slope, a stone entrance in the hillside, and a woman standing tall beside a boy. Both figures held lanterns, their light reaching upward into a dark sky. Behind them, rendered in fainter strokes, were other figures, a dozen or more, blurred and indistinct but undeniably there, each one carrying a basket or a jar or a bundle, walking forward, walking together. At the bottom of the canvas, in handwriting that was young and unsteady, but legible, someone had written 7 words. She dug down so we could rise. Margaret read it twice. Then she folded the canvas, gently carried it into the pantry, and pressed it between 2 flat stones at the very back of the wall, in the spot where the buttercrock used to sit, where the air was coldest and the dark was deepest and nothing ever spoiled. She sealed the door and walked back to the cabin, where the fire was burning and the boy was waiting, and the first flakes of the new winter were just beginning to fall. The snow came that night heavier than the dusting before. By morning the valley was white again, and the cold pressed down on the cabins and the trees and the stone pantries buried in the hillsides. But the chimneys burned steady. The doors stayed shut against the wind, and inside each cabin on shelves and hooks and racks of stone, the food held. Margaret stood on her porch in the first gray light of morning and looked out at the valley she had almost lost and almost left and almost died defending. The snow lay even and clean across the ground, unmarked by footprints, undisturbed by anything but the wind. It looked like a blank page, like something waiting to be written on. She went inside, stoked the fire, and put water on to boil. Noah came down from the loft, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and sat at the table without speaking. Louisa emerged from the back room with the twins already fussing, already hungry, already alive. Margaret set the kettle on the hook and looked around at the cabin that had been built for one and now held five. At the table James had carried across 1,000 miles of open land. At the boy who had come to her bleeding and afraid and was now sitting with his hands folded, waiting to be told what needed doing next. She thought about this drawing folded between the stones, about the woman who had dug a hole in the ground because she had nothing else left and no one to help and no reason to believe it would matter, and about all the people who had laughed at that hole and then come knocking when the cold proved them wrong. They had laughed, but now they dug. And in the earth they did not just store food, they stored something harder to name and harder to lose. The knowledge that one person working alone in the dark with bleeding hands and a broken heart could build something strong enough to hold when everything else fell apart. And that the thing she built could become in time the foundation for something none of them could have built alone. The water boiled. Margaret poured it. The steam rose and curled in the morning light, and outside the snow kept falling steady and white and clean, covering the valley, covering the slopes, covering the stone doors of 20 pantries dug deep into the earth where the frost could not reach and the food would keep, and the winter, for all its fury, could not take what they had learned to protect.